Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Nick Newman didn't plan for the Verity to explode the way it did, but once the final piece slid into place, there was no stopping the reckoning that followed, and Genoa City would no way look at Sienna, or Matt, the same way again, because what began as a quiet dubitation turned into a public unmasking that left jaws on the bottom and alliances shattered beyond form. It all started with Nick's gut, that familiar Newman instinct that had saved him more times than he could count, the same feeling that told him Sienna's story didn't relatively line up, that her responses were just a little too advised, her timing too perfect, her feelings rehearsed like lines learned long before she ever set bottom in city. At first, Nick tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress, to the endless games people played in Genoa City, but also Matt's name surfaced again, rumored in hushed tones, buried in old records, tied to fiscal movements that shouldn't live, and suddenly the once refused to stay buried. Nick dug still at first, pulling strings through connections at Newman Enterprises, leaning on old favors, reconsidering sealed lines that had been designedly misfiled times agone, and what he set up stupefied him to the bone. Sienna wasn't just connected to Matt, she was guarding him, hiding him, and worse, helping him execute a long-term plan that targeted the Newmans from the inside. Every regard between Sienna and Matt that formerly sounded inoffensive now screamed conspiracy, every casual discussion revealed layers of deception, and Nick realized with mounting horror that the two of them had been playing Genoa City like a chessboard, immolating pawns while aiming straight for the king. The final evidence came in the form of a burner phone Nick recaptured from a storehouse unit Sienna had rented under a fake name, a phone filled with dispatches, in ciphered language, and unmistakable documentations of identity. Matt wasn't dead, wasn't gone, wasn't a ghost from the history, he was alive, bedded, and nearer than anyone ever imagined, and Sienna was the mastermind who made it all possible. Nick didn't vacillate once the Verity was inarguable. He called everyone together under the guise of a routine meeting, drawing Victor, Nikki, Sharon, and a sprinkle of Genoa City's most influential numbers into the room, while Sienna arrived confident, ignorant that the mask she'd worn so precisely was about to be ripped down in front of them all. The moment Nick locked the doors and turned on the screen, the atmosphere shifted, pressure creaking like lightning before a storm, and when the first communication appeared, Matt's voice unmistakable, his words trickling with arrogance, Sienna's face drained of color. Nick didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to, because the Verity spoke louder than any blameworthiness ever could, and as he laid out the substantiation piece by piece, from falsified individualities to retired accounts and long-con manipulation, the room erupted in unbelief. Gasps echoed, Nikki's hand flew to her mouth, Victor's expression darkened into commodity murderous, and Sharon goggled at Sienna like she was looking at a foreigner wearing a familiar face, because in that moment, Sienna wasn't a victim or a misnu stranger, she was exposed as a strategist, a fabricator, and Matt's willing abettor. Matt tried to intrude, tried to spin another story, but Nick shut him down with one ruinous disclosure after another, climaxing in the evidence that Matt's real identity had been hidden behind layers of forged documents, surgical differences, and times of careful planning, all designed to insinuate Genoa City under the radar while exacting vengeance for once sins he believed the Newmans committed. Sienna eventually broke, her countenance cracking as the weight of exposure crushed her, and when she admitted the Verity, admitted that she'd met Matt times agone, that they'd planned everything together, that Genoa City wasn't a coexistence but a target, the fallout was immediate and explosive. Victor stepped forward, his voice cold wave and fostering, declaring that there would be consequences, that no bone crossed the Newman family and walked down unscathed, while Nikki demanded to know how numerous lives Sienna had manipulated, how numerous hearts she'd played with while serving a vendetta embedded in falsehoods and preoccupation. Sharon's heartache was palpable as she realized moments she'd participated with Sienna were erected on deception, and the treason cut deeper than any adversary attack ever could, because this wasn't just business, it was particular. As security moved by, Matt made a hopeless attempt to flee, but Nick anticipated it, blocking the exit and delivering the final blow by revealing that law enforcement was formally on their way, sloped off hours before with substantiation strong enough to ensure there would be no slipping through the cracks this time. The room erupted into chaos as Sienna screamed that Nick didn't understand, that the Newmans had destroyed lives long before she ever arrived, that this was justice, not vengeance, but her words fell flat against the mountain of damage she'd caused, and when the police eventually arrived to companion both her and Matt out and bind, the silence left before was blaring. Genoa City reeled in the fate, whispers spreading like campfire as the news broke, alliances questioned, trust cancelled, and the consummation sinking in that two of the most unpretentious numbers in city had nearly brought an conglomerate to its knees. Nick stood at the center of it all, shaken but resolute, knowing he'd done the right thing indeed as the emotional risk counted heavy on his shoulders, because exposing Sienna and Matt didn't just save the Newmans, it forced Genoa City to defy a brutal verity about how fluently appearances could deceive, how deeply manipulation could run, and how no bone, no matter how fascinating or satisfying, was ever truly above dubitation. As the dust settled and the echoes of the reveal continued to ripple through every corner of city, one thing came sorrowfully clear: there was no caching presently, no pretending the history could stay buried, and while Sienna and Matt were eventually unmasked, the scars they left before would hang Genoa City for a veritably long time to come, because in a city erected on secrets, the most dangerous bones were the bones hiding in plain sight. In the hours that followed the unmasking, Genoa City didn't just buzz, it jiggled, reeling under the weight of a verity so massive it felt like the ground itself had shifted, and Nick Newman slightly had time to reuse his own feelings before the consequences of Sienna and Matt's exposure began crumping one by one. Phones chimed continuous, whispers turned into captions, and every coffee shop, boardroom, and living room came a courtroom where people replayed the moment again and again, anatomizing every regard Sienna had ever given, every word Matt had ever spoken, wondering how they'd all missed it. At Newman Enterprises, Victor moved with ruthless perfection, sealing vulnerabilities, ordering forensic checkups, and promising retaliation for every single move Matt and Sienna had made against the family, his fury stewing just beneath the face as he pledged that treason on this scale would no way go unanswered. Nikki plotted in a different way, visited by the consummation that she had offered kindness and trust to a woman who'd weaponized empathy as part of a long con, her guilt mingling with rage as she questioned how numerous lives had been still manipulated while everyone differently slept. Sharon's pain cut the deepest, though. She retreated inward, replaying recollections that now felt poisoned, moments of connection stripped of authenticity, and for the first time in a long while, she wondered if her belief in people had made her eyeless to peril cashing right in front of her. Nick tried to be strong for all of them, but when the doors eventually closed and the adrenaline faded, the weight of what he'd uncovered crashed down hard, leaving him scuffling with the reality that uncovering the verity didn't abolish the damage, it only illuminated how close they'd come to losing everything. Meanwhile, Sienna and Matt's arrest transferred shockwaves far beyond the Newman route, exposing a web of influence that touched corners of Genoa City no bone wanted to admit were vulnerable, as investigators uncovered shell companies, forged contracts, and planted operatives whose only purpose had been to destabilize power structures from within. Matt, recalcitrant in deed and guardianship, claimed his campaign was over, claiming that the Newmans' sins stretched back generations and that his exposure was simply a chapter, not the ending, while Sienna oscillated between guilt and defense, averring she'd loved the megacity indeed as she betrayed it, a contradiction that only strengthened the public's outrage. The press feasted on every development, turning private pain into public spectacle, and Nick set up himself standing at the center of a storm he no way asked for, forced to answer questions he wished he didn't have to while guarding the people he loved from farther detriment. As days passed, the ripple goods only boosted, former abettors questioned their own once dealings, secret hookups unraveled, and the sense of safety that formerly defined Genoa City felt irreparably cracked, because if Sienna and Matt could hide in plain sight for so long, who differently might be wearing a mask? Nick's resoluteness hardened as he watched the megacity he loved struggle to recapture its footing, and he made a silent pledge that translucency, not paranoia, would be the heritage of this agony, indeed if earning trust again would take times. Victor, no way one to leave matters untreated, began orchestrating a counterattack that extended beyond legal consequences, icing that every avenue Matt and Sienna formerly controlled would be disassembled, their influence cancelled so completely it would be as if they'd no way was at all. Yet indeed as the Newmans tensed their grip, cracks appeared within the family itself, old injuries restarted by the memorial that adversaries frequently knew them better than they knew each other, and Nick set up himself defying uncomfortable trueness about fidelity, alert, and the cost of assuming the stylish in people. Late one night, standing alone in his office overlooking the megacity skyline, Nick allowed himself a moment of reflection, admitting that while he'd exposed Sienna and Matt, the palm felt bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that trust, formerly shattered, no way returns to its original shape. Genoa City would move on, it always did, but the period of innocence was over, replaced by a sharper, more conservative outlook that would define connections for times to come. As whispers of unborn trials, hidden cohorts, and undetermined vendettas dallied in the air, one inarguable verity settled over the megacity like a heavy fog: the unmasking of Sienna and Matt wasn't just a reproach, it was a warning, and Nick Newman, having pulled back the curtain, knew there was no turning down from what lay beneath ever again. Days turned into a grim blur after the apprehensions, yet Genoa City refused to settle, as if the city itself rejected the idea of check, because every new disclosure about Sienna and Matt sounded to peel back another subcast of spoilage no one knew was, and Nick Newman set up himself standing at the crossroads of justice and fallout, knowing sharp well that exposing the verity was only the morning of a much longer war. The disquisition widened with intimidating speed, uncovering that Matt's reach had extended into banking systems, political favors, and private medical records, all still penetrated over times through individualities so strictly drafted that indeed seasoned investigators admitted they'd no way seen anything like it. Sienna, formerly painted as the architect, began to deteriorate under interrogation, her confidence dissolving as prosecutors brazened her with substantiation proving she hadn't just supported Matt but had laboriously manipulated people's feelings, orchestrating romantic snares and strained Gemütlichkeit to prize secrets that latterly came munitions. Her tearful concession, blurted to the press within hours, transferred another shockwave through Genoa City, because it revealed that some of the city's most ruinous recent heads hadn't been accidents or concurrence at each, but deliberate pressure points touched off to test how far the Newmans could be pushed before collapsing. Nick read the paraphrase late one night, his hands shaking as he realized how close his family had come to total destruction, how fluently trust had been exploited, and how a single taradiddle, repeated frequently enough, could rewrite reality. Victor replied with fury that framed on preoccupation, demanding names, demanding timelines, demanding answers for how such an elaborate plan had gone undetected under his watch, and though he no way said it out loud, Nick knew his father criticized himself just as important as he criticized their adversaries. Nikki tried to be the emotional anchor for the family, but indeed she wasn't vulnerable to the creeping paranoia, chancing herself questioning old recollections, wondering whether kindness had come a liability in a city where manipulation played as vulnerability. Sharon, still reeling from treason, eventually brazened Nick in a raw, emotional exchange that left both of them shaken, admitting that Sienna's deception had restarted injuries she allowed were healed, reminding her of every time she'd trusted the wrong person and paid the price, and Nick could only hear, knowing no reason could abolish that pain. Meanwhile, Matt refused to go still, using court appearances as a stage to deliver cryptic warnings, intimating at unseen abettors and untreated business, his trim confidence fueling enterprise that the agony wasn't truly over. Every time he spoke, Genoa City held its breath, and Nick watched from the gallery with a blend of rage and determination, covenanting that whatever games Matt still believed he was playing would end then. As the trials approached, former associates climbed to part themselves, some turning on Matt and Sienna in exchange for impunity, others evaporating entirely, leaving behind unanswered questions and a trail of fear that only strengthened the sense of apprehension gripping the city. Nick worked lifelessly behind the scenes, coordinating with legal brigades and security experts, not just to cover the Newmans but to restore some measure of faith in a megacity that had been psychologically commandeered, knowing that fear was Matt's final armament and refusing to let it win. The strain took its risk, however, manifesting in insomniac nights and moments of mistrustfulness where Nick wondered whether exposing the verity had bring further than it saved, whether Genoa City would ever feel safe again after learning how fluently it had been wisecracked. Yet in rare quiet moments, he also saw adaptability, people coming together, participating information, choosing translucency over secretiveness, and it reminded him why the fight signified. When the first shamefaced plea was blazoned, the megacity exhaled, but the relief was transitory, because it came with the consummation that responsibility didn't undo damage, it only conceded it. Sienna's eventual breakdown in court, her voice cracking as she admitted she'd lost herself nearly between revenge and survival, drew mixed responses, pity from some, fury from others, but for Nick, it was simply evidence that lies, no matter how precisely constructed, always collapsed under the weight of verity. Matt's sentencing impended like a final chapter staying to be written, yet indeed also, the pressure refused to dissipate, because Genoa City had learned a brutal assignment: monsters didn't always advertise themselves, and safety was no way guaranteed. Standing formally more in his office overlooking the skyline, Nick allowed himself a rare moment of resoluteness, admitting that while Sienna and Matt had been unmasked, their heritage would serve as an endless memorial that alert, honesty, and courage were the only defenses against darkness caching in plain sight, and as the megacity sluggishly began to rebuild, Nick Newman understood that his part wasn't just to cover his family but to ensure that Genoa City would no way again mistake a precisely worn mask for the verity. As the weeks stretched on and the trials edged closer to their inevitable conclusions, Genoa City existed in a strange limbo between justice and unease, and Nick Newman felt that tension in every breath he took, because even as progress was made, the shadow Sienna and Matt cast over the town refused to fully lift. Court documents revealed more betrayals than anyone expected, minor players who'd quietly fed information, institutions that looked the other way in exchange for favors, and each new disclosure reinforced the chilling truth that this conspiracy had thrived not just on deception, but on complacency. Nick watched familiar faces avert their eyes in public, guilt and fear etched into expressions that once radiated confidence, and he understood then that this scandal wasn't just about two villains being unmasked, it was about an entire city being forced to confront its own blind spots. Victor doubled down on security and influence, but beneath the iron resolve was a man shaken by how close his empire had come to collapse, and in rare, unguarded moments, he admitted to Nick that power meant nothing if it couldn't protect the people he loved. Nicky sought healing in quieter ways, reaching out to those hurt by Sienna's manipulation, offering apologies she never owed but felt compelled to give, determined not to let bitterness define her future. Sharon, slowly rebuilding herself, made the brave choice to turn her pain into purpose, advocating for honesty and accountability, her voice resonating with others who felt violated by the lies that had infiltrated their lives, and Nick found strength in her resilience, even as he mourned the innocence they'd all lost. When Matt was finally sentenced, his defiance cracked for the first time, the mask of control slipping as the weight of consequence settled in, and though he hurled one last warning about truths yet to surface, it rang hollow against the finality of the judge's gavel. Sienna's fate followed soon after, her quiet acceptance a stark contrast to the chaos she'd unleashed, and as she was led away, Nick felt no triumph, only a sobering clarity that exposure didn't erase the damage, it merely stopped it from spreading. Genoa City reacted not with celebration but with reflection, conversations shifting from gossip to accountability, from shock to resolve, and slowly, trust began to rebuild in cautious, deliberate steps. Nick returned to his routines with a renewed sense of purpose, understanding that leadership meant more than dominance, it meant vigilance, empathy, and the courage to question even the most convincing narratives. Standing once again beneath the glow of the city lights, he acknowledged that while the scars left by Sienna and Matt would never fully fade, they had forged a stronger awareness, a collective refusal to let lies dictate reality again, and in that hard-earned wisdom, Nick Newman saw the possibility of a future where Genoa City, forever changed, could finally move forward with its eyes wide open. The day Kane is eventually taken into guardianship, Genoa City watches in stupefied silence. The optics are brutal. The man who formerly walked free while Phyllis was dragged down and bind now stands on the other side of the glass. He searches the crowd artificially, and when his eyes land on Phyllis, standing calm, composed, victorious, commodity inside him fractures. There's no triumph in her aspect. Only ineluctability. Their courtroom showdown becomes the stuff of legend. Phyllis testifies with perfection, not emotion. She recounts Kane's manipulation, his stimulant, his advised retreat. She explains how he deposited her as both guard and goat, how he exploited her character to make the story credible. The jury listens, rapt. This isn't a woman contending for sympathy. This is a strategist laying out a chessboard, Kane allowed. Only he could see. When Kane takes the stage, he crumbles. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But in subtle contradictions, avoidance, and cracks in the persona he formerly perfected. Every attempt to shift blame defeats under the weight of proved evidence. Every appeal to reason sounds concave.